Sean muy bienvenidas, bienvenidos.
Good morning, everyone. You're all welcome to the second day of our virtual and regional conference, teaching practice in vulnerable contexts from KIX LAC. I am Pedro Garret. I am coordinator of the Research Center of KIX LAC. And today I will have the pleasure to be with you today in the second day of the conference. I think we will have more people participating in these first minutes, but I will share with you some information. This session has simultaneous interpretation to English, French, and Spanish, so we want you to use your preferred language in the interpretation button that you will find in the lower part of your screen. If you have any question, you can send them through the chat of the platform, and after the presentation of our speakers, we will have a Q&A session. Today with us, we have an audience, a very diverse audience, with participation from different countries of the region. We have representatives of the ministries of education, organizations of the civil society, the academia, unions, international cooperation organizations that we celebrate, because this diversity of views is what enriches our work. We ask you that through our chat, please share your name, your role, the institution you work for, and the country you are joining us from. For those who are just joining our meeting, we welcome you to this second day of the virtual conference on teaching practice from vulnerable contexts and the learning process of KIX LAC. It's a pleasure to start this second day of the conference that you know that is part of the mobilization cycle of knowledge promoted by KIX LAC that is focused on reflection, the collective action, and the use of evidence in Latin America and the Caribbean. This year, 2026, we are having a specific focus on policies and teaching practices. Our focus in this innovation center is a space of exchange for innovation of educational leaders from Belize, Dominica, El Salvador, Grenadines, Guatemala, Guyana, Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Lucia. I want to thank all these countries and other countries of the region that are here with us today. The KIX initiative is promoted by the GPE and the IDRC. The KIX LAC Center is led by SUMA and the OECS. GPE KIX, along with the cooperation of IDRC, encourages or promotes projects based on different regions to generate evidence and strengthen, in order to strengthen the educational policies. One of the main features is that research is not an isolated exercise. It is a process related to the needs of the educational actors and is based on the exchange of policies and practices. In Latin America, KIX has promoted different projects related to the development of the TPD, the education in the early childhood, and also the inclusion, educational resilience, the strengthening of educational systems, and the improvement of the different systems. These projects have created relevant evidence in order to understand in a better way which strategies may close the gaps in vulnerable contexts and which context favors this adaptation and sustainability. These projects are part of an ecosystem of collaboration that joins different organizations, implementers, researchers, ministries of education, communities, and other actors that are going to improve the practices of the educational policies. This change in the learning between different countries and between different projects, it accelerates the escalation of innovations. It strengthens the capacities of the educational systems of the region in order to respond to vulnerability contexts. It's in this framework where we develop this virtual conference, teaching practices in vulnerable contexts, learnings from the KIX LAC projects. Yesterday, we considered the thematic blocks about the implementation of different practices for excluded communities and implementation of different strategies to reduce gaps. Today, we are going to develop the adaptation of educational systems in vulnerability contexts. With us, we will see two different research projects from the KIX LAC ecosystem. The presentation of each project is combined with the comments from different representatives of the ministries of education in which these projects have been implemented. This way, they will contribute with a view of public policy, and they will strengthen the bond between the generation of evidence and the institutional action. And then we will close this block with a dialogue about the based on the questions of the audience. So we ask you to send us your questions through the chat. Now we ask the panelists to respect the times and to comply with them. Now, before we continue with the development of our first block, we will present a first presentation about the context that will provide the main axis of this conference, the use of evidence for the decision-making, the institutional decision-making process, and also the equity and inclusion to protect the most vulnerable ones. We invite Luis Felipe de la Vega, a sociologist with a master's degree and a doctorate in sciences of education. His research lines are related to the educational policies, evaluation assessment, and leadership. He has led different research projects and studies for different organizations, and also he has been a consultant in different educational organizations, universities, and he is currently an associate professor of the Faculty of Education and Social Sciences from the Andrés Bello University. He will share some evidences and reflections about these transformations in the systems and in the schools that are related to the education. Thank you, Luis Felipe, for being here with us. Thank you, Pedro. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second, please. I want to thank the invitation, and I would like to share these reflections with you. I made some decisions about how to do this and which concepts I'm going to use as pivotal concepts in order to talk about the policies and the role of policies when closing the gaps in terms of the expectations of our societies, in terms of education or in relation to education. And this concept is the one related to the learning opportunities. This is a concept that we use on a daily basis, but we do not define it. And that is a problem because sometimes we do not understand the same thing for the same concept. This concept of learning opportunities, it's not new. It's been there for 60 years. It's been there for a long time. And we review that again and we revise it again. We see that in the literature, in the policies. For example, the Sustainable Development Objectives use them, and that's objective number 4. So I'm going to share an idea of how to use these learning opportunities as a way to guide the policies and also the definitions of what our educational systems may prioritize when improving the education. So in the world, there is this trend, or there was this trend to assess the success of the educational systems based on their results. So what I'm saying here is that if I apply an evaluation or a measure for evaluating my students, I'm going to evaluate that there is a good result of my work if the result of this learning were optimal. Nonetheless, this might lead to misunderstandings because we know that many processes occurred so we can have some results, and sometimes the conditions in which these processes occur are not optimal or they occur in an unequal way. So it's not fair to compare everyone only based in one expected result without understanding the processes or the conditions in which those processes occurred. And also, on the other side, when you only see the result or the end, it makes it difficult to see how to favor, how to improve this, or how to reach those achievements. So under this logic, my proposal is that we can see the whole picture, that we see that it's a relationship of processes that are located in a scenario that will allow us to understand and to explain what we achieve. And under these objectives on what we achieve, one of the main goals of the educational systems and very important for our region is related to the educational equity. Because our region, the countries that are part of our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, are very unequal. And our systems are quite highly segmented. It means that schools, teachers, students are in very diverse scenarios with very different conditions. So one important task of an educational system and of the educational policies is to make the conditions even or equal. So we have less gaps that create these structural conditions in our societies that make them uneven or unequal. So as we have this inequality, the theory about equity, as we have this inequality, we cannot provide the same to everyone. So we have to make it provide in a different way according to the characteristics about the needs and the projects of our students. And under this logic, the concept of learning opportunities can be very useful. So these learning opportunities are going to be understood as those processes, actions, elements whose presence, accessibility, and quality will enable students to access, participate, and progress in meaningful learnings. I'm going to use a wider concept. When I'm talking about learning, it's not only the cognitive learning, but we are talking about goals, objective goals. This is a set of factors that when they are there, when they are implemented, they are going to favor the opportunities of our students, of them learning in a better way. So why are these opportunities important? Because they help us. It's not only a reference, it's not only important to know which they are or who, or for those who work on these educational policies, they help them understand what is it that the policies should do in order to promote them. It's not only about learning about what those opportunities are. It's not only promoting the actions that are going to favor improvement, but we have to use this concept of learning opportunities in order to prioritize what we have to do so those opportunities appear. So our main focus could be, along with the results that are also very important, we need to know we have an important challenge related to our goal, to our task, that these learning opportunities are available in each one of the classrooms of each one of the schools of the system. So, this relationship, how is this relation? And this idea has a lot of relevance for the educational policies. Here in the center you see, or in the middle, you see those learning opportunities, which are those processes that occur inside the classroom and that make our students to learn more and in a better way, or to develop their projects in a better way. So these are going to be experiences, strategy, devices that we implement in the classroom, the availability of those resources, and the quality of those resources. We're going to call them learning opportunities. And the fact that they are present, it's fundamental to have obtained results. Otherwise, what we are doing is to skip what happens in the classroom. If we think that we will have expected results without thinking that there are opportunities for everyone, in that case, the success of a student will only be related to his or her conditions and not to what the system or the school provides for the student. But the story does not finish here. If you see the left side of the slide where it says conditions, there is this set of aspects that we can do, that those who are outside the classroom, so those opportunities are present. And for us, this is very important and enriching, and it guides the decision making. Why? Because from the policies, from the practices of a school director or from what the school district create, is to create these conditions, is to make these conditions available and offer a better quality of the conditions. So then in the educational process, these learning opportunities appear or are produced, and they will be materialized in results that are of different kinds. And I know I use the word results to use a more frequent or frequently used concept, but for us it's educational achievements. Because we can, from the development of the learning opportunities, we can sustain different achievements. Certainly, the cognitive learnings or curricular learnings are very important, but also those related to the emotional or to the human development, from the socio-emotional aspect, from the well-being, and also from the trajectories of our students. So the opportunities may favor one or more of these educational achievements. Because of the type of region that we are having, I'm going to emphasize in the conditions, what is it that from the educational policies we can do in order to favor those learning opportunities so they are available in the different spaces of the educational system. So the invitation is that if we have that concept of equity, our policies do not have necessarily to be implemented in the same way with the same contents in all types of scenarios. There will be institutions that will need a little bit more of our presence. Also, they will need more other specific aspects based on their needs, so we can contribute to the equity. We cannot contribute to equity only providing the same for everyone. That's one part of what the equity will provide, but equity also needs differentiation. So under these conditions, as you can see here, we have 6 aspects here that are conditions for the learning opportunities. Out of these 6 ones, 5 are object of control, to say it somehow according to the conditions of the system, that we can do from the policies, or we can provide the possibility so this could happen. It's based on the policies, on the financing, on the systemic alignment, how the educational system works, their leadership possibilities or coordination, things related to the institutional culture, the the climate, and also the resources available and the professional capacities. That's one of the most important conditions in order to create these learning opportunities. There is another factor that is a condition where the educational system has no control of it. Those are the context actors. The society here has to wonder if they can make or create any changes so that there is a better equity, but the system cannot change that directly. Then we have the opportunities, and here we want to see the difference among the different types of opportunities. And here we have at least four. The educational processes are the classical ones that are where the teachers are in charge. They are the ones that are performed by teachers. We have formative assessment, feedback, monitoring, but also the differentiation, pedagogy differentiation processes that are related to the inclusive focus in the pedagogic practices. Also, there are some devices that are learning opportunities, for example, the existence of programs, reincorporation initiatives. They are also opportunities of learning opportunities, and things related also to the formative experience of the students and their attributes, how they live this experience. What's the relevance for the student? That these processes are available for him or for her. And finally, what I wanted to mention about from this perspective is that when we develop these learning opportunities, we empower different types of educational achievements, and the educational systems have the need and
institucional. Y con ello podemos mejorar ciertos aprendizajes curriculares. En el ámbito de la diferenciación,
also in terms of differentiation, the tutoring, the adaptation, or pedagogic differentiation, it requires adequate pedagogic resources and activities that will allow this or will encourage this type of activities. And in terms of continuity, if we have these programs of going back to school, we need to have these policies of coordination, of promotion of this, and then we will see results related to permanence, progression, or better possibilities of these of students finishing school. So in order to close this part, our invitation is to think how the educational systems may be focused, monitoring what happens in the system, in what should be done as a policy. How are we responsible in order to make sure that these learning opportunities are present, and they are present in an equitative way? It's a duty of the state and of the policies that this is done this way. And these general overviews will provide only one aspect in order to progress in equity, but equity requires a differentiated management or differentiated scope, and that's the invitation for this dialogue. And here we see this concept of gaps, and these opportunities want to decrease those gaps. I want to close my presentation here. Thank you so much for the possibility of sharing my work with you. Thank you, Luis Felipe. Thank you so much for your presentation, for giving us some context, scope, and the importance of the learning opportunities in their mediation role, how to guarantee this equity that requires also the differentiation. And in this last slide, where we had the integration between conditions, learning opportunities, and educational achievements, were very interesting for me, because the presentations that are coming soon are going to tackle one of these aspects, especially from going beyond the performance or the learning results or the classical learning results, but seeing this from a response of a life trajectory. Thank you so much for this. Now we'll give the floor, or we will start with the blog about the adaptation of educational system in vulnerable context, the question that leads up in order about a moment for the Q&A sessions via chat or at the end in the Q&A session. First of all, we are going to invite Santiago Cueto, who is licensed in educational psychology, and he is a doctor by the University of Indiana. He has been a research investigator or in different universities in Davis and Oxford, and also he has been a consultant of the IDB and the UNESCO. His main areas of interest are education and educational and human development in context of poverty. He's the main researcher in Grade. He will share with us the main findings and lessons learned from the project Adapted, Observatory for Educational Resilience in Latin America and the Caribbean. Santiago, the floor.
Thank you so much, Pedro, and to Suma's team for the invitation to be part of this relevant event. So, as you were saying, I'm going to be talking about the laboratory. Sorry, that's the last slide that went first. How about that? Here's the first one. So, this is my presentation. It's about the Adapted Laboratory. That it's an observatory that was created in late 2024 to study and analyze resilience in educational systems in Latin America and the Caribbean, prioritizing GPE countries, GPE KIX countries, to collect, produce, and disseminate evidence, experiences, and relevant studies to enhance adaptability of educational systems to current inequities, emerging challenges, and future disruptions across primary and secondary education. So, in terms of concepts, is connected to what Felipe just explained. I thought it was quite interesting, the explanation he shared with us. So these are the countries that are covered by the observatory. As I said, we are talking about GPE countries, these 11 countries you see on the screen. And I'm going to share some case studies with you with three main goals. First, identifying and analyze meanings and practices of resilience in the educational system of partner countries, of GPE partner countries. The second goal, explore changing scenarios and potential future disruptions in GPE partner countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to provide recommendations for crisis preparedness and tools for effective responses. So the first goal is connected to what is happening right now. The second one has to do with what might happen. And in the world we are living, I think we get this feeling that we are living with this ongoing vertigo, right? Because of the speed of changes. So there's an area of research that in English is called foresight research, right? That it covers future scenarios So this has to do to our second action line. And we are going to be conducting a survey. We will be sharing that with you in the following weeks to try to anticipate what's coming. I'm thinking ahead. Most of your questions are probably going to be related to the use of technology and particularly artificial intelligence. And the third goal has to do with mobilizing evidence through events like the one we are having today, so we can discuss the main results of our research, our findings. So we prepared a report, a comparative report. I'm going to tell you a little more about that. We are also preparing 3 case studies. Maybe you heard about the first one because we gave a presentation about it that's focused on disasters. And the first lessons learned that I would like to share with you is that the literature doesn't talk about natural disasters anymore, because of course there's this idea of nature, but the impact of this natural disaster, of course, have to do with human action. And this is something we're going to be discussing in a few minutes. A second thematic report covers migration. That's the one we are working on right now. Because this changes, right? The situation evolves. Maybe right now we are not seeing its highest peak, but in the past few decades, we've seen these strong migration processes to the north, for example, to the US, but we also see migration happening, people coming from Venezuela, just to name a couple of examples that we see that are more current. And the third thematic report focuses on violence, different types of violence, but everything connected to education, of course, and particularly primary education, primary and secondary education. And one of the first things you learn when you focus on these fields is that these things are connected. So, for example, you could think about how emergencies caused by disasters are connected to migration processes, but also with violence. And of course, we need to work on that. We also had some workshops for scenario planning and the surveys I mentioned, the one that we will be sharing with you very soon. We also produce newsletters. I hope you are subscribed to our newsletter. If you are subscribed to the SUMA newsletter, and if you're not, you're invited so you can learn more about what Adapted is doing. And we also have our virtual platform on our website. One of the main findings of our research after a year and a half of work has to do with how we understand education system resilience, ESR. And to conduct our research, we use 3 documents as our foundation. You see them on the presentation. We are using the IDRC framework from the Canadian cooperation, the USAID model, of course. When we used to have that USAID, there were interesting models about resilience, and also the work of the International Institute for Education Planning of UNESCO. That was also one of the foundation documents we used to see how systems can adapt and respond when you have threats by strengthening structure, processes, and people, with particular attention to the most vulnerable groups. And you see the literature there if you're interested. You don't need to copy that right now. You can find all of this information in the actual report, and I'm going to be sharing the link later. But as you can see, we are emphasizing here on this idea of resilience. Usually, when you think about it, you look at it from the individual point of view. But from our observatory, we are thinking about the system's resilience, the possibility to adapt to changes. Of course, individual resilience is also relevant. It needs to be considered, but we are focusing on the system's capacities to respond and adapt to different shocks. So part of our findings, after analyzing three types of documents, we analyzed a curriculum, educational framework law, and development plans for education. And after analyzing that, we saw that there was this focus on infrastructure, education management, curricula, and teacher training. Those were the focus when talking about resilience. And sometimes there were some mentions of vulnerable populations, which is also related to what Felipe explained earlier. And this idea of individual resilience versus the systemic one, as I said before, focus on students' capacities instead of the education system resilience. And so we analyzed content. We were counting, how many times we saw the word resilience in the documents I mentioned earlier. But also, we were analyzing the context in which the words were being used. So that's why we were focusing on education plans and not just general law. When talking about educational resilience, disasters, climate change, and migration are recognized as interconnected challenges linked to social, economic, and educational factors, which, as I say, are interconnected. So this was the object of our first publication as adapted. As I said, you can find that on our website, and maybe Aranza, who's joining us today, can help me by sharing the link via the chat for those of you who are interested in this first document. The second document we prepared focuses on disasters. And if you read the report, what you will find here is a series of notions connected to how we conceptualize disasters. And as I said before, it's not just about natural disasters, the impact of nature, but human action that can actually mean that an event has a higher impact or a lower impact depending on preventive measures that were taken, the response given when it happens. So we see risk indexes like the one you see to the right. Here, of course, we combine nature, its role, and human action. And we see higher risks that are faced by countries like Haiti, for example. And you see there the gradient that goes through countries like St. Lucia, for example. And we are going to be talking about the situation of these countries later on. So some key concepts here. Now, going to the left side of the slide, when we talk about education in emergencies, the response capacity, because of course these indexes are only useful if you actually use them to take preventive action. Of course, it's always impactful to see this, right? See the red color and the green color. But as I say, these should be elements to guide action, not just to cause impact in those who read these indexes. We see uneven impacts. The effects of disasters vary depending on location, level of preparedness, and response capacities. And the Caribbean and Central America are highly exposed to disasters, as I said already. We analyzed some particular cases. I think I might be running out of time, so let me go quickly through this. In the case of Dominica, this was quite interesting because there was a hurricane in the late 2010s, and I was quite amazed by what happened after that, because they were started again in the future. So they started working on a resilient school infrastructure, risk management, teacher training, and education continuity. So we see here factors that have to do with the topic of this conference, teacher training and the work you do at schools. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there was some work in disaster risk reduction, teacher training, student safety committees, and multi-sectoral coordination, because this is something that impacts the work. Of course, there's some work from the government that needs to be done, but also there's a role of international cooperation and also many parties from civil society and the private sector that, in partnership with local communities, need to do their part. And in El Salvador, we've been working on safer and more prepared education systems in emergencies. There was a lot of work in infrastructure, and this is also relevant for countries because school infrastructure needs to be prepared for these disasters, which is what we're focusing on in this particular slide. But on the other hand, there are many challenges because most of the time schools are used as shelters in case of emergencies, when you have people who lose their homes. And of course, this disrupts the system. Actually, caring for students and complying with that educational role. And that role needs to be covered using digital means. But again, we go back to equity here because not everybody has access to digital devices or the internet. It's interesting, but also urgent and require action to be able to provide the required equity. Talking about teacher training, some of the implemented initiatives in El Salvador, we had teacher engagement in the technical working group on disaster risk reduction for the right to education. Seeing a lot. It was said earlier that this idea of the right to education that covers much more than access to formal education, right? It also has to do with equity to opportunities when it comes to education, and also equity when it comes to results or level of achievement. The question we should ask when we have disasters is, how is the right to education impacted after a disaster? And for El Salvador, we also prepared some school risk management plans, the identification of local hazards, and emergency response protocols. In Dominica, we had teacher training in disaster risk management and first aid, response protocols before, during, and after disasters. And for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, training in shock responsive education and mental health, which is another key topic that we've seen over and over in our research. It's not just about academic learning. The previous speaker talked about social emotional aspects of it. So let me summarize this quickly because we're running out of time. Number 2 there, you see vulnerabilities. We are talking about this overlap between gender, ethnicity, rurality, poverty, and migration, whether voluntary or forced, we see here the main groups that show up when you start reviewing equity in connection to natural disasters or other shocks like the ones I mentioned earlier, migration, for example, and violence. So that means we need this intersectional approach, and that also requires work that goes beyond education, and teachers usually say that they are not equipped for that. And that's why these case studies are so interesting when it comes to teacher training. Number 4 on the slide, it says 11 million students in Latin America and the Caribbean experienced disruptions to their education in the past 20 years, or from 2000 to 2019. So again, this is a relevant topic. Even if it impacted just a few students, but we're talking about millions here. And for the discussion, some ideas, how can education systems adapt to ensure educational continuity and quality in context of crisis, mobility, or high vulnerability, which is a topic we are going to keep working on, and I would love to hear your thoughts about it. And some final ideas. This is the last slide of my presentation. We need to adopt a comprehensive approach to education system resilience, an approach that includes different actors or stakeholders, but also different goals related to access to school, to the learning outcomes, but also well-being and social, emotional, and mental health. Considering equity with an intersectional approach, as I said, we need also to strengthen the role of teachers in schools in emergency response, because usually they're not prepared for it. Ensure educational continuity through flexible and multimodal learning, and also integrate. And just to wrap up, our website and an invitation to subscribe to our newsletter so you can check our reports. And with this, I conclude. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Santiago. Thank you so much for that presentation, for those thoughts you shared. As you said, it's quite important, right? Thinking about the concept of educational resilience in our region, because of course it is critical for governments and other stakeholders, many of those who are here today, to think about how we tackle disasters in the migration and violence, which is the work Adapted is focusing on, and this cross-sectoral approach, right? Because there's a lot to be said and done about these topics. Thank you so much, Santiago. And now we would like to hear from the Ministry of Education of St. Vincent and Grenadines, who will share some thoughts and reflections around this project of the KIX LAC ecosystem. Idelia, the floor is yours.
Pleasant good morning, colleagues, partners, participants. On behalf of the Ministry of Education, Vocational Training and Innovation, Digital Transformation and Information, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I extend sincere appreciation for this opportunity to contribute to such an important dialogue on building resilient education systems. The adopted report, our persistent challenges, and our ongoing efforts to strengthen educational resilience. The findings reflect the realities we confront daily in relation to disaster risk and affirm the strategic direction we have taken as a small island developing state navigating compounding risk. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we are a hazard-prone nation, and in recent years, our education system has been repeatedly tested. We have endured the COVID-19 pandemic, dengue fever outbreak, all in 2020, and the explosive 2021 eruption of the La Soufrière volcano. And in 2024, the devastating impact of Hurricane Beryl. These events, they have disrupted learning, damaged infrastructure, and they underscore the need for systemic, coordinated, and adaptive approach to education continuity. Adapted, the report highlighted the importance of robust governance and policy framework, and we have operationalized many of the recommendations and initiatives through our work on school safety. Our school safety policy was approved in 2019, and post our disaster experiences, we would have updated the policy in 2024 based on the lessons that we learned. We have a dedicated school safety and research unit, and that has expanded from a single officer to a staff of 3. We have also aligned with the global and regional framework, including the Worldwide Initiative for Safe Schools and the Caribbean School Safety Initiative. And we have also adopted the comprehensive school safety framework using the 3-pillar approach. And those 3 pillars we know to be safe learning facilities, school safety and educational continuity management, and risk reduction and resilience education. And over the years, what we have done is to attempt to undertake initiative from each of those 3 pillars. Recently, we completed a national adaptation plan for education, our education sector, and we are in the process of drafting a contingency and continuity plan to ensure that our policy instruments remain dynamic and responsive to emerging threats. At the institutional level, we have been building capacity and strengthening our education system, and we continue to invest in resilient infrastructure, ensuring that our schools are designed and where they have been built many years ago, we ensure that they are repaired and retrofitted to withstand hazards, because for us, our schools also serve as emergency shelters in our communities. In relation to post-disaster recovery during Beryl, a number of our schools were impacted, especially in our smaller islands of the Grenadines. And so we use that opportunity to strengthen those affected facilities and ensure that they are up to standard. Through one of our regional initiatives with CDIMA, we have adopted a building condition assessment tool to support data-informed infrastructure planning. However, we have had some challenges with that tool, but we see the relevance of it, and so we are working to improve our ability to make use of that building condition assessment tool. We are also rolling out an improved education management system to help monitor school closures and impact, enabling evidence-based decision-making, and that would also align with the adopted recommendations. At the school level, we are embedding resilience as a structural component of education rather than being reactive. So we have model school safety plans and other documents that help to guide our schools and to ensure that they have school safety committees, that they are developing the plans and not just developing, but they are testing these plans. We do have challenges in terms of getting the schools to develop their plans because, of course, they consider the academic goals more of a priority. But one of the things that we say to them, if your schools are impacted, then your academic priorities cannot be achieved. So we work closely with our schools and the committees to ensure that there is some level of compliance. And we are even taking that further this year. We have been discussing with our senior education officers that when the schools submit their development plans, they are also going to submit their school safety plans. So we are making progress in that regard. Also, we do quite a bit of training. Some of the topics that we cover are education in emergencies, psychological first aid, shelter management, fire safety, and other critical areas. And to date, we have trained hundreds of teachers in different areas so that they can go back to their schools and they can enhance the safety of their schools. Presently, there is a program called ROLES, Recovery of Learning and Emotional and Psychosocial Support. And that particular program is helping students recover from learning lost due to the pandemic and the volcanic eruption. And it is also providing psychosocial support for those persons who would have experienced those events. We also do have an integrated climate change mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction curriculum. That curriculum was finalized in 2020, and because of COVID, we were delayed in terms of rolling out that particular curriculum. And over the years, we have been working on the rollout. We have faced some challenges, but we are still working on that. That particular curriculum covers our lower secondary school, and it uses a tier approach where students progress from one level to the next. So for example, at level 1 or form 1, they would learn about family disaster plan. At the second level, they would learn about school safety planning. And at the third level, they would look more at community or national disaster planning. We have also worked with our teachers division of the community college to have teachers trained at the pre-service and the in-service level to roll out the curriculum or to teach that curriculum. However, again, part of the issue with that is our monitoring and evaluation. And so we are working on upscaling that support to ensure that the curriculum is integrated, not just in a particular subject, but it's geared across subject areas. One of our most recent innovation is the establishment of...
Yes. We have a last minute to make a closure about your intervention. Thank you.
Right. So after this initiative, I will wrap up. So we have a student emergency response team in our primary and secondary school, and we did the pilot in 6 schools. And now we are upscaling to other schools. This is a student-led initiative where students help to raise an awareness, identify risk, and recommend mitigation strategies. We work with many different partners locally, regionally, and internationally. And despite our challenges, the adapted report validates our strategic priorities and our ongoing recommendation. And we will continue to persist with these initiatives and those recommended to ensure that every child right to safe, continuous, high-quality education is taken into consideration no matter the crisis. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Idelia, por tus valiosos comentarios y
Thank you so much, Idelia, for your valuable comments about the priorities of the government and the Ministry of Education in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I consider this three pillars that you mentioned in order to assure safe students' trajectory for the different actors as well, and the update of the strategic plan for the risk management. This has allowed us to evidence that how these findings and recommendations from ADAPT-TD have contributed to continue strengthening the educational resilience at a systems and at a school and classroom level. I think that's really valuable to have this conversation or to hear about this to have this conversation between this innovation and coherent with what is going on with the Ministry of Education in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. We're going to see the second project of this block. We're going to invite Jorge Andrés Galvez, an educational researcher with a lot of experience in this type of projects. He has worked in qualitative, quantitative research, looking for the prevention of violence in education, with the support of USAID, Fe y Alegría. Jorge Andrés is the current director of the Center for Educational Research in Guatemala, in the Universidad del Valle in Guatemala, and along with him we will have Giovanni Pacheco, Walter Lopez, and Jorge Andrés and his team will share the main findings and lessons learned from the project Flexible Educational Trajectories in Guatemala. Thank you so much, Jorge. The floor is yours.
Muchísimas gracias. Muy buenos días. Un gusto compartir con todos ustedes.
Thank you so much. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here with you all today. And while we get ready with the presentation and everything, I would like to take a few seconds to thank IDRC for their trust through KIX. The project underwent a few changes when it was getting started because of what was happening globally, but we were able to make it happen. So I would like to thank you for your support. I would also like to thank the Ministry of Education. We've been working closely here in Guatemala and SEBA because they were the base for the project we've been working on. And that's why we're here today to tell you about the findings. Let me tell you a little bit about the goal of the research or the project. It is to find that opportunity for scaling up this initiative, which is quite promising. It's been being implemented for 15 years in Guatemala, working with vulnerable children that are outside of the system. And there are so many stories, different sources of funding behind this project that started to become more relevant, so much so that the Ministry of Education decided to take it to other areas of vulnerable children. So for that, it's important to understand how it works and how much you can still broaden the project or scale it up, and how you should do that. And that's the goal of this specific project. And for that, we came up with the idea for 5 studies to answer that question about scalability. Those are the 5 studies you see there on the screen. So the team and I sat down to think about how to respond the question of what do systems need to do to adapt to these young people that are in vulnerable conditions. How do we give them access, because they have a right of education like everybody else, but for some reason they've seen their educational trajectories interrupted. So throughout the research, we started thinking about this life trajectory, educational trajectory that are disrupted, and how programs like ours allows to bring them back after interrupting their trajectory. And we were able to identify 3 main aspects. And then the team led by Leslie Rosales will tell you a little more about the findings of the studies. But the first adaptation that systems need to implement is to have the enabling conditions. And for what we learned from the study, this has to do with having an actual space that is free, safe, that feels close and inclusive. Of course, this is not a surprise. Many of the presentations have covered this, and we all are aware of that, all of us here. The second aspect has to do with implementation and the curriculum foundation behind it. There's this concept or this foundational learning. You talk about what you are going to do before the actual implementation. And programs like ours do this work to make sure it is actually effective. And then when it comes to implementation, some key features: flexibility with schedules, with access, assessment, and delivery. And let me highlight assessment, that point, because Luis Felipe talked about opportunities, learning opportunities. And we believe that coming from that concept of learning opportunities, that's the one that produces the highest tension between more traditional systems and more flexible systems, the ones that we've been focusing on in these 2 days. So that balance, when you think about the traditional indicators systems report on, when it comes to caring, attendance, or the attention children paid, and the quality of education, and how we assess that, I think is something our projects need to focus on, thinking about the future, because we've seen that there's a great tension there. How can we demonstrate whatever it is that we need to demonstrate through more flexible interventions? And lastly, we come to the role of teachers, which is key in all of the presentations we are listening to today. The role teachers play in projects or interventions like this that focus on vulnerable populations. It's not your regular teacher anymore. We think of them as mediators, coaches, tutors, someone who provides support. And with the studies we're conducting, we are thinking about that role and how you can achieve an intervention in this area. And now I'd like to pass the microphone to Leslie Rosales, Dr. Rosales, to tell us a little more about how we can answer this question. Good morning, everybody. I'm Leslie Rosales. I'm part of this project that we call TEF. And as Andrés was saying, we try to organize the evidence produced by our research to answer the initial questions of the webinar that has to do with how educational systems can adapt to guarantee continuity and educational quality in context of crisis, mobility, or high vulnerability. As Andrés said already, we structured the presentation into 3 parts. First, we believe one of the key findings of our research to answer that particular question is the fact that educational systems need to produce the conditions that guarantee continuity and quality of education of these students that are impacted by crisis, mobility, or high vulnerability. And some of these conditions, Andrés already mentioned, have to do with programs that are free of charge to provide a safe space that it feels close and that is inclusive. But these conditions should not compromise learning the core skills, which is a key topic of interest for the Ministry of Education in Guatemala. How did we get there to these conclusions? This is one of the findings of our research focused on access to education that we implemented a few months ago. And as part of that research, we ask young people about these variables that have to do with what makes them go back to school or get involved in a more flexible education program. And as you can see there, there are different dimensions that have an impact in their coming back to school. One has to do with non-discrimination or inclusion, economic accessibility, the fact that it's free of charge, physical accessibility to school, meaning that it's nearby in terms of geography, In Guatemala, this means that it needs to be close by, because that's one of the main limitations when young people try to continue with their education. Another dimension has to do with administrative accessibility. This has to do with the ease of continuing your studies, thinking about bureaucracy or the necessary paperwork. Another dimension is how this project fits with their project for their life, and also that it is idiomatic or language pertinent, which is also important for our country. So all of these dimensions were relevant for these young people to continue with their educational trajectory through these more flexible programs. So who are these young people that are interrupting their educational trajectory? We found that most of them come from the more vulnerable groups of the population when we think about indicators related to the level of poverty at home. So we see the ones that have less access to different goods, the conditions of their housing, and the work of the head of the family. And as you can see here, another finding is that young people drop out of school at around the age of 14 when they experience a transition to secondary school, which is impacted by their conditions, their economic conditions. That's the proxy we used for our research. Another relevant finding is that education systems need to implement flexible models, but as we said before, without compromising the quality of the learning outcomes, particularly the core learnings. This means that we needed to study the educational model itself, and if there actually is an educational model that could be systematized and that has this foundation for flexible education. And by flexible, we mean schedule, access, as I mentioned before, in terms of territory or through computers or different platforms, flexible in terms of assessments, but it doesn't mean making it easier, but flexible enough for young students to be able to demonstrate what they have learned in different ways, not just a traditional one, and also being more flexible with the delivery of education. But another relevant finding is that when we implement these models, we need to consider different types of educational trajectories, because it is our conclusion that for young people in Guatemala, this is quite diverse when they access flexible education, not just the traditional model we think about. So now I will give the microphone to Giovanni so he can tell us a little more about these learning trajectories or types. Hi, I'm Giovanni, and I'm here to tell you about the types of population that are accessing flexible education. We see different types here of trajectories. As Leslie mentioned, not everybody follows the ideal trajectory because there are different situations, right, that have to do with your background, with your economic situation, the structure of the home, etc. So we were trying to identify from the students that undergo the flexible model, what was their living trajectory. So the first type we identify had to do with this living trajectory that was conditioned by the fact that they weren't interested in studying. They weren't interested in how they were being taught. But their environment, their social environment, was also important in determining their learning trajectory. And for that, we needed to develop two subtypes. First, when the social environment was enabling education, or this lack of interest, so they accepted their lack of interest. So that's why the student decided to not continue with their studies, and nothing happened. But after some reflection, some thought, they decided that education was important for their trajectory. But when they're of a certain age, the formal system doesn't allow them to re-enroll. And for that, this is important. We also saw another subtype where we also saw that lack of interest, but the social environment actually acted or intervened so the student wouldn't drop out, so they could find a more flexible model that could adjust to the needs of the student. So with that, they were able to continue with the learning trajectory because they were able to find a more flexible program. In this slide here, we see another type of life trajectory that is more common, that has to do with disruption because of economic conditions. For these typologies, we see that families that go through different crises, or they need children to provide, to also produce some income for the family. Sometimes this happens at an early age. So we're talking about child labor that impacts the educational process. But here we also were able to see that they were interested in continuing with the studies, but because of these conditions, they weren't able to do it. So when we see these flexible programs that are free of charge, they are able to go back to the educational system. And the fact that it is free is key because we are talking about people who need to work. So they also need flexibility in terms of time, so they can, because they can put together their own schedules. Another typology is connected to the social environment or the family situation that does not value education as a tool that could be useful for their human growth, as a useful tool for young people. So families impact learning trajectories in this way. And we see that when these young people leave home, they find new opportunities to continue with their studies thanks to these types of programs. So they value the fact that they can go back when there are the enabling conditions to attend these programs. We also saw some trajectories that are conditioned by gender, and we are talking about women in particular. This has to do with the role they play as caregivers or housework or taking care of children. So in these cases, we see that maybe a partner or the family demands them to drop out of their education so they can commit to this type of chores. And then later on, they are able to go back and continue with their trajectory. And there is another typology that has to do with the fact that we have this formal education. Sometimes they do not have access to programs because of bureaucracy when it comes to assessing knowledge, for example, and other institutional failure related to protecting people. So basically, we saw people that were victims of bullying, that were expelled, or they weren't attending school to prevent being victims of violence or bullying. Thank you. Thank you, Giovanni. I'm going to skip these slides and continue with the information related to mediators, which has to do with this delivery of education through them. As Andrés mentioned, we have explored how an education model that was created to include the different trajectories that Giovanni just explained, how can we translate that into specific tasks for the mediators, who are the ones that are actually providing the learning opportunities that Luis Felipe and Andrés mentioned already. So we conducted a study where we translated this idea following the Dakin methodology. And with that, we were able to identify that the tasks of teachers are framed in or organized in 6 dimensions as part of the work of SEIVA. You see them there. And we took this to an implementation model. And with that, we were able to determine a percentage of implementation fidelity. So here we saw that there was a high fidelity in terms of implementation, which is not a surprise when you're talking about these mediators that are trained for this particular task. But of course, ideally, we would want an educational system to see the conceptual framework of the model translating into specific tasks and the hiring of mediators so they can implement the model with higher fidelity to scale it up. Leslie, I'm sorry to interrupt. We need to wrap up now. Yes, of course. Maybe just one final thought to wrap up. Right, so a final thought would be that we need to understand the population we are serving and build a model that takes into consideration the different typologies of educational or learning trajectory in vulnerable contexts, like what we have in Guatemala, to bring that to specific tasks that mediators might implement, because that could later become a more managerial role, right, with different roles in terms of reference and all of the tasks we do on a daily basis. Thank you very much. We would like to thank the team of Universidad del Valle in Guatemala for this relevant presentation. It's quite interesting what they shared about educational systems that need to guarantee the right to education even when you're undergoing a crisis, and particularly when we are talking about a vulnerable population. And I also wanted to underscore the role of flexible models that do not lose quality, and also analyzing the school trajectories, because those of us need to think about that and having a more comprehensive approach when it comes to life trajectories, right? Beyond education. Now I would like to yield the microphone to César Teny, who comes from the Ministry of Education of Guatemala, who will share some thoughts of this project. Thank you, César, and the floor is yours.
Can you hear me well? Yes, we can hear you well. First of all, thank you so much for your invitation, for the invitation to this virtual conference, specifically about the research that was conducted under the component of flexible educational trajectories, specifically on the model from the Asociación Grupo Ceiba. First of all, I would like to give a context to my presentation so we understand like the whole picture of the country. Guatemala has 19 million inhabitants. It's a multicultural, multilingual country. We have 4 people, the Maya people, the Xica people, the Garifuna people, and the Ladino people. We have 60% of our population is indigenous. These indigenous population maintain their language, as it was mentioned before. They keep their customs, their traditions, their whole understanding of the world, how they see life, the spiritual world. They have this organizational system. That's in terms of the country itself. I would like to tell you a little bit more about some of the terms about the educational reality in Guatemala. There are 2 different systems. I don't think this happens in other countries, but in Guatemala, we have the school subsystem where they serve population under regular age. Then we have a second subsystem, which is the extra school system. This subsystem is the one that serves the population Ceiba works with. This population, most of them work, most of them have their families, and they need a second chance. And this is in the framework of this second subsystem that is called extra school subsystem. But as a Ministry of Education, we have different programs for this type of population. We have the accelerated primary school, distance education through the PRONEA program. We also have the flexible mode program for the secondary school, and we also have the technical areas through a program called CEMOCA. The extra school education, it's the one that is considered as a subsystem, as a mechanism from the state to serve young people and adults. So when we talk about this type of education in Guatemala, we are talking about the education for young people and adults. In other countries, it is known as EPA. So the educational reality of young people in Guatemala, we have almost 4.2 million people, of young people and adults that are out of the educational system, that are economically active from 15 years and older. It's about 3.9 million people who are out of the educational system and that are economically active. In terms of their academic level, we have 1 million people who have no educational level. We have 1.5 million who have completed their primary school, and 1.3 million have not finished the secondary school. We see that we call that as the basic cycle. When we talk about the budget from the ministry for the extra school subsystem, we have 1% in order to serve this population that is out of the system. Under this context, and I think it's quite important to talk about this dialogue space and to have this reflection about this type of realities. And here is where I want to talk about the Ceiba project. In Guatemala, under this subsystem, there are about 80 institutions, implementing institutions. Those are called the strategic alliances or the institutional alliances, where they start working with the Ministry of Education or collaborating with the Ministry of Education to serve this population. We see associations, foundations, cooperatives, churches, municipalities, etc. And in this framework of the entities or the implementing entities, we see Ceiba. This is an association, and the results of the research are quite important because the educational model that has been researched and that Ceiba has been implementing for many years is projected to be an alternative project designed to serve the needs of those who need an opportunity for studying. Many people migrate because of their geographical location, people who live in rural areas where they do not have any kind of access to energy, to roads. This type of model works in this type of areas because this model reaches the population, and it's not the population the one that goes to look for the institution. Second, we have the access to an education with a flexible focus. When we talk about flexibility in this type of educational models, that's such an important thing, because if we see, for example, the school system in terms of enrollment, we have the open enrollment from January to between January, February, and March. But if there are people interested in studying the primary school, the basic cycle, or the diversified cycle, if they arrive in May, they will have to wait until next year. So, considering this flexibility, the time is very different, is very important. That's why we mentioned that when talking about the enrollment in the extra school system and the model implemented by Ceiba, they can enroll in any time of the year. For example, if we find a group of people, 5, 10 people, interested in studying in May or in August, in September, November, immediately they can start their studies. So this type of flexibility is a cross-sectional access that allows the access to education. Also, they talked about the results, that is something very important, in the inclusive education. Most of the population that Ceiba serves and other models like this or other institutions like this are people that are older than 18. You cannot discriminate them because of their age, their sex, their indigenous or their ethnicity, or because of their poverty or economic situation. This component of inclusive education is a component that sets and or identifies this type of models because they do not exclude anyone. If a person is 15, 20, 30, 40 years old, and they want to continue their studies either from the basic cycle or the diversified cycle, this type of model opens or creates that hope. It's a light they see in order to continue with their studies. So in this case, I'm talking about three dimensions, the three dimensions that were mentioned: the non-discrimination, the physical accessibility. I think that's a very important component, because the idea is that these type of models or programs reach the population. And the third dimension is the economic part. Ceiba Group have shown their capacity in terms of management, and thanks to their management, they obtain funds, international support, and also the support from the Ministry of Education. This type of support is fundamental because of the fact that this is for free. Because of poverty, many people cannot enroll themselves in the school. So the possibility of having this for free is something very important for these cases. I'm sorry, César. We just have 1 minute left, so you can wrap up your presentation, please. So one of the recommendations that we should consider is this part of free access to education. The other point that I want to highlight is the context. As these are indigenous populations, the model has to be related to the context, and also the positioning of the education for young adults and adults that Ceiba does. We have to strengthen that part, positioning the education in this term. The continuous education for teachers, it's an important point to maintain the educational model from its philosophical part, its curricular part, and also the methodology. And last, the co-identification. I think it is important to consider that the educational model is identified with the community, and also the community identifies itself with the project. Thank you so much, César, for these important comments of showing us this perspective of the reality of education in Guatemala. I think it's important to highlight the importance of a research to serve the needs of these populations seen as a flexible life trajectory. And the model has to reach the population and not the opposite. I think that's quite relevant. Now we're going to open this space of dialogue about the things that we shared in this blog, and we've been collecting some of your questions, from your comments in the chat for all of our panelists. First, we saw a question from Peru, from Ademir Sanchez, who asks to Luis Felipe. Luis Felipe, are you there?
Sí, Pedro, aquí estoy.
Yes, I'm here. So Ademir asks that here in Peru, they have this diagnosis assessment at the beginning of the year. This is like, he wonders how relevant this process is from your point of view in order to see the learning opportunities the students have, because this information is, they don't give importance to this information. They only consider the grades or what you have in your reports. So what's your point of view about these type of tests, diagnosed tests, and how can this be related to the learning opportunities concept that you presented? Thank you so much, Ademir. I think that the instruments that provide this diagnosis information, they are very valuable for the institutions, not only for the system. Here in Chile, we have both type of evaluations, and for the educational system, the standardized evaluation that is called SIMSE is valuable, but the diagnosis evaluation is more valuable for schools. This type of evaluation allows to ask questions, more concrete questions about the learning opportunities that are being offered to students that will allow to understand the achievement situation where they are. And the modality of this diagnosis assessment could be followed or by a follow-up evaluation in the years, so they favor the identification of improvement of changes after the implementation of these teaching practices. After this, we have the formative assessment logic, that is the one that provides concrete information in order to reflect on our pedagogical practices and in real time, to say it somehow, to make the decisions about learning that would allow to bring these students closer to the expectations, the learning expectations that we have. Thank you, Luis Felipe. Now we have another question from Honduras, from Maritza Barahona. This question is for Santiago. She says that from the Curriculum and Assessment General Directorate in Honduras, they would have a relationship between the teachers' training with educational policies that are mainly related to poverty, violence, and vulnerable contexts. So she wonders that if in the results from the Adaptity Observatory and the systematic revision that they have done so far, maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the flagship cases in which these policies related to teachers' training are directly related to the attention to the populations that are under vulnerable situations. I think that's a hard question, and I think Idelia showed some of the examples of what they are doing in her country. We have seen examples. Let me go back to in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I think that's a difficult question. I think there is not much research about the efficacy of these interventions, but the experiences from Dominique and St. Vincent and the Grenadines have to be revised, and they are in the document. But I would say that we need a lot of research on this, about how good these initiatives are, how efficient they are. So I think we will have to follow a research line on this matter. Thank you, Santiago. And maybe Idelia, as you mentioned her, according to the cases that you showed, Idelia, would you like to comment a little bit more about this information provided by Santiago?
Your microphone.
All right. Yes, sorry. Could you repeat the question that was asked, please?
Sí, Idelia. Lo que te preguntábamos
So
era,
the question is,
o lo que nos decían desde Honduras era
we
de
had
qué
this question from
manera un
Honduras,
poco se ha vinculado las
how
políticas de formación
the
docente
training of
para
teachers policies have been
acompañamiento
related
en
to
contextos vulnerables,
the accompanying
pobreza,
in
violencia,
vulnerable
¿no?
contexts,
O
in
en
context
gestión
of
por ejemplo, de desastres y
in the
catástrofes, por
management
ejemplo,
of
Grenadines.
disasters and emergencies, what has occurred in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
In our case, our teachers are generally very active in terms of disasters. For example, our teachers generally become shelter managers when something is happening in country. So they are usually quite engaged, but that is also a good and it's also a negative because what we saw during the eruption was that many of our teachers were managing shelters, and when teaching was online, they were expected to teach and manage those shelters. So they had dual responsibility. And in some cases, some of them were even relocated from their normal place of residence. So they take on quite a lot of responsibilities in times of disasters. They're expected to continue as normal when they are affected and also have responsibilities. Nonetheless, our teachers are very receptive to training, and they are assisting at the school level in terms of developing plans, doing simulation exercises, and so on. We've had a very good interaction over this year in terms of them reaching out to the unit for supporting, evaluating exercises, and so on.
Perfecto, Idelia. Muchas gracias por comentarnos un
Thank you,
poco
Idelia, for telling a little bit about the role of the teachers in the framework of the risk management and complemented it with what Santiago said from the research they've been doing from ADAPT-ED. Now I want to move to this other project, the one of the University of El Valle in Guatemala. So the question for the Jorge Andrés group and also for César. Maritza asks about if the research has been useful about these vulnerable populations, specifically in the definition or the characterization of indigenous people for the creation of the bilingual curriculum.
Maybe Jorge Andrés or César would like to say something about this bilingual interculturality. César, perhaps, right? All right. Right, so right now we are actually working in drafting a curriculum that responds to the specific characteristics of the population. The CEIBA model also implements this. We use a base national curriculum that is designed for this particular school system. So that's the project we are working on right now, specifically to develop this curriculum for this extra school system. And as part of this framework, of the building of this curriculum, we are also including everything related to indigenous people's culture, not just when it comes to linguistic features, or because that's just one component, but the culture in general, because we're working with people, young people and adults that are mostly bilingual. So of course the educational process needs to be bilingual. to some degree. I was going through various documents that are a result of the research, and we have testimonies from the students that are part of the non-formal education system that talk about bilingual education in their indigenous language and Spanish as well. So it is important to include these components that have to do with language under this special training for young people and adults. Thank you so much, César. Andrés? Yes, just very quickly. The project is not a part of that work related to the curriculum, but we appreciate the question because now I think we can discuss our results with them, the ones working on that, so they can consider the results of our research. Thank you so much. I would like to your team maybe to elaborate a little on these topics. We have a question about those aspects of the model of flexible educational trajectory is more effective to respond to the needs of vulnerable young people in particular. What would be, the critical aspects you would highlight? Right. If I may, based on our research on access, it has to do with tuition-free education. And another relevant topic, but we didn't have enough time to talk about that today, had to do with the timeline they have to go back to school, to go back to whatever flexible education program they decide to follow. We have seen that young people, when they go back after 2 years of dropping out, they are more likely to stay longer. And this, if you combine this idea with the age of the students, when they're younger and when they're male, this timeline or this window of opportunity to go back is even more relevant. When we are talking about young women, they tend to go back to school after a longer period. However, we are talking about higher rates. They do stay when they come back. So we need to consider gender here as a variable, a time, how long it's been since they left or dropped out, and the age when they dropped out. So I would say those are 3 things we need to pay attention to when it comes to bringing them back and recovering their trajectories. And let me add another element that has to do with safety. That perception between young people that see school as a safe space. So in our case study with SEIBA, we saw that they are working with children that have been involved, in crime, that are surrounded by gangs, but they're able to come to this social contract when they agree that the school is a safe space and that actually is better for them to come back and continue with their education. Great. Thank you so much to everybody for your presentations, for answering the questions. Of course, we're making notes of the comments from our audience, and I'm sure we can continue with the debate later. We already shared the websites to have a deeper look at both projects, to learn more about everything you shared with us here today. So to wrap up the event, we will have time for a final reflection that will contribute to further discussions. And for that, we invite Florencio Ceballos, a sociologist, master's in educational policy from the University of Paris. He has experience in innovation in education, information technology to work with vulnerable populations. He has also worked in youth-related topics, violence and conflict in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia.
Florencio es especialista senior
Florencio is Senior Program Specialist for KIX at IDRC in Canada. So he will share some final thoughts to integrate what we have been listening to between yesterday and today around these projects that are part of the KIX LAC ecosystem. Florencio, please, the floor is yours.
Pedro. Muchas gracias a
Hi,
todos.
thank you so
No
much,
sé, Pedro, la
Pedro, and
presentación la van a compartir
everybody.
ustedes,
Are
o
you going to be
No sé
sharing
si
the
quieres,
slides?
Florencio, ¿deseas que nosotros la
puedo
presentemos?
Would you
compartirla
like
yo?
us
Déjame
to
ver.
do that? No, I can do it.
No, creo que no voy a poder compartirla yo desde acá.
No, I don't think
Ok, no sé
I'm
si alguien del
able to
equipo
share.
me puede ayudar compartiendo, por favor.
Could a team member help me with that, please?
No, acá voy a poder. Sí, ahora voy a poder.
¿Tu preferencia es que sea el PPT en español o en
En
inglés?
español, en español.
The
ahí
Spanish
estamos.
one, okay.
Se está compartiendo. Unos minutos, por favor.
Just a sec.
Perfecto.
We are
Ya
sharing
la tenemos en
now.
pantalla. Adelante,
All
Florencio.
right, here we
Ok,
go.
bueno,
Florencio,
muchas
go ahead.
gracias, a los
All
organizadores
right,
de
thank you so
todos
much to the
presentadores. Thank you very
organizers,
much for
all of our
all the
speakers.
participants today and yesterday. It has been extremely interesting. I'm going to speak in Spanish. So if you need to connect to the translation, I'm going to speak in Spanish today. But thank you. Yo quisiera compartir un par de
I would like
reflexiones
to share
sobre
some
algunos temas que me
thoughts
parece que son
about
comunes y que tienen
some
como una
topics that I
mirada
think are common
futuro.
to the different projects and allow us to
A partir de lo que hemos ido
think
escuchando, cosas que
ahead,
pueden
right?
dar
To think about what we do in the future.
ejercicios
So
de
based on the
reflexión aplicada
experience
que
of the
ustedes
different
podrían aplicar
projects
y
and
que
the
parece
applied
que
research
dibujan algo común.
studies, we
En
see
primer
some
lugar,
commonalities.
quisiera decir
But first, I would like to
la
say,
siguiente diapositiva, por favor,
if we go to the
que
next
esto
slide,
es un
please.
esfuerzo, esto es un esfuerzo colectivo.
We are
¿sí?
talking
Asociación
about a
colectivo.
collective effort
Un esfuerzo en el
that
que han
has been
participado
growing over
numerosos
time.
espacios,
It involves different
tanto el
partners,
TPE y IDRC, tratando de
both
poner en
the
funcionamiento, imaginando
GPE
este
and the
funcionamiento, un mecanismo global,
IDRC that are
interconectado,
trying to
generando
imagine
evidencia,
this
conectando
global
evidencia, generación de
mechanism
evidencia,
to connect,
movilización,
the evidence
decisiones de
that it
política
produced,
pública.
mobilization, decisions
El
around
segundo,
public policy.
o sea, en ese mismo espacio también el rol, por
And
supuesto, de
following that
Suma, de
idea, of
OICS y
course,
de
we need to
WhatsApp
think about
regional
the
para
role of
conversar, para ir
SUMA, the
construyendo,
OECS, and
entendiendo
KIX
las
LAC
realidades
to
locales,
talk to the
convocando,
different countries
invitando
to better
actores,
understand the different
y
realities,
levantando
inviting the key
debate.
stakeholders, the key topics,
En
and
tercer
driving
lugar,
the
muy
debate.
importante, lo hemos escuchado hoy día, el rol de
Thirdly,
los ministerios,
of
las
course, we need to
agencias,
highlight the
las
role of
universidades nacionales, los sistemas
ministries,
educativos que abren el
agencies
sistema educativo
at
para
the local
ofrecer,
level
para
in each
extraer esos
country
datos,
because
para
they
analizar
open
la
their
evidencia
system
y para
to
utilizarla.
produce, analyze, and
Y
use the
finalmente, y muy
evidence.
importante, los
And
proyectos de investigación
finally,
aplicada de
we
KIX
see
que
the
producen
applied
y
research
promueven
projects
esa
supported by
evidencia.
KICS
Entonces,
that
a partir
produce
de
and
reconocer,
promote
digamos, que
this
acá
evidence.
es una
So I
mesa con
think it's
muchas
important to
patas a la
acknowledge that we have
exposición,
a table here
quisiera
that
pasar
has
a la siguiente
many
presentación,
different
perdón,
legs. And based on
porque me
that, I would
parece
like
que
to
más allá de lo
continue
específico que
by
cada
saying
uno de
that
los proyectos
beyond the
tendría y habrían
specifics of each
representado, y yo
project, everything we heard
profundizar en ello
yesterday
porque
and
ustedes han
today too,
profundizado mucho.
and of
Y
course,
me
I'm
parece que
not
hay un
going to
tema
say
que es importante
much about
y
that
que
because you
todos
already
ellos
explained the relevant
están
topics, but I think
focalizados en
there's
primer
something
lugar
common
en temas que son urgentes, que
that
son
for all these
importantes, que
projects
son
that are focusing
prioritarios
on
en los
urgent
países y en la
topics
región,
that are
y todos están
priorities in
vinculados
their
de una otra manera
countries,
con la promoción de la
and they're
igualdad,
all
la equidad
connected
y la
with
inclusión.
promoting or advancing
Educación 2020 que se fue
equality
ayer,
education.
con un foco importante
We heard Educación 2020
en contextos
yesterday.
rurales, ¿no es cierto?
They
Y de
talked
la
about the
realidad de
work done
contextos
in
rurales en
rural
Honduras,
context,
un
and of
desafío
course the
particularmente
reality of
vulnerable. En el caso de
the
Educo,
rural world in
una
Honduras, for
visión de
example.
primera
In
infancia
the case of
vulnerable. En el caso de
Educo, how they're
Clave,
focusing on
foco de
vulnerable
la violencia de género en las
eh,
escuelas. En el
early
caso de
childhood
Raise Your
education,
Voice and Lucha y
GLADE
Argentina,
with the
una mirada de
focus
género
with
con
Raise
foco
Your
en
Voice,
masculinidades,
focusing on
también
gender
presentada
violence
la Universidad
and the role of
Valle, el
masculinity.
trabajo en torno a niños,
To
niñas y
earlier we
adolescentes
heard about
transexuales,
the
escolarizados,
Universidad del Valle,
directivas
about
interrumpidas,
those
y GRADE
students who see
finalmente
disruptions in
invitándonos
their
y
trajectories,
ayudándonos a pensar en
and
esta realidad
GRADE with their
común del
invitation
continente,
to
cómo
think
adaptarse a ser
about this
resilientes
common,
frente a
this shared
desafíos
reality in our
naturales
continent, how to be resilient when it comes to natural or social or other disasters. So these are topics that are relevant beyond the specific research. And I think there are some things that have to do with how this research approaches knowledge. And this is by design and conviction, right? From a GPE and the IDRC, we're convinced that we need to promote this research that is embedded in the national context. And to do that, you need to have local teams. You need to have local researchers leading these projects. And that is important because sometimes we do not consider that. Secondly, we need to think what we can do in terms of research in specific context. Thinking about, for example, randomized studies or LCTs, sometimes they do not adapt to what you can actually do when you're undergoing an emergency or lack of funding, difficulties with access, etc. So I think this is important too. The research also pays attention to results and impact. That is also by design. And that is why sometimes we're there in your ear asking about the project, where they're conducting the monitoring, asking for documents, being able to identify cases of impact, because it's important that the research doesn't stay there with the diagnosis, but actually move forward to try to help produce the necessary changes. The different research studies we've heard about add value because they're listening to the experience of teachers, families, communities, the technical teams involved. They're not just extracting or mining information, they're not just interviewing them, but they're also trying to consider their particular point of view and how they interpret that evidence and the problems they face, what they think about that evidence that is produced. And that is why the workshops for feedback and the training opportunities are also connected to the need to invite or get involved other stakeholders that are part of the educational process and learning. And of course, we're always connected to the educational ecosystems. Of course, the local researchers have a better understanding of the countries. They have the networks. Sometimes it's easier for them to approach the ministries of education compared to what we can do from Washington or Ottawa or Santiago. That's important too. Ecosystems. We have talked about ecosystems, and I would like to add some thoughts. We talk about decision makers and researchers, practitioners, teachers coming together. So, unlike nature, these ecosystems for educational evidence do not exist. They need to be created, but they do share something in common with nature, and it is that they're quite fragile. It's easier to destroy them than to build them. And we are going through times where these systems are being impacted by politics, by financial issues, the impact of new technologies. So we need to understand that these local or regional ecosystems to mobilize knowledge, which is what we want to create, is not a given. We need to build them on a regular basis. We need to continue working on that. Secondly, these ecosystems depend of our ability to get ministries engaged and working with other stakeholders from academia, those who are on site, that a production circuit of knowledge, etc. And that means we need to find a common language, common format. Instead of expecting decision makers to interpret a 200-page report or research, we need to think of a common language that makes it easier for them to understand and also produce this evidence-based culture. It is a way of making decisions that is valued, that takes into consideration the use of the better available evidence, the best available evidence. So this ecosystem needs a lot of work and a lot of commitment and effort. We also talked about scaling and sustainability, which are not the same but are connected. We cannot think about scaling up a model if you're not thinking about the sustainability of that model, and you cannot think about a model being sustainable without a plan to scale those programs up. And that is something we've been working on strongly. Because we believe we need to go beyond a successful pilot. We need to understand how, when, with what conditions we can scale an innovation for it to have a wider impact. And that means we need to acknowledge institutional, political, and financial context that have to do with decision making. When we're thinking about making an innovation sustainable, it's not just about costing, it's about understanding the different spaces. When it comes to public funding, with budget plans, legal frameworks, to understand how we can do this work. And we need to do that work. And for that, we need to converse with the educational systems, with authorities, with decision makers. And we also need to be alert, because sometimes there's a window of opportunity, not always, but sometimes a new window opens and you can do some advocacy, you can talk about what you have done, about your research, about what you have been able to gather as part of a public policy process. And we need to be able to identify those windows of opportunity when they appear. Are we missing one slide? Am I wrong? Just a sec. Oh no, my apologies. It's okay. Now, to wrap up, thinking about the future. I leave this meeting with questions and reflections because, of course, we are thinking about the idea of having a new phase for KIX. That, of course, depends on many factors and processes, but that's what we're trying to do. So we need to think about what we have learned here that could inform a KIX 3.0. How do we preserve and are able to replicate or widen the impact of the experience? How do we continue with this community of practice with everybody who has been involved in this collaborative process with public institutions? Because we shouldn't abandon that work, right? So we need to better understand what role our grantees can play in this process, or even all of us. That is also relevant for this reflection. So that was it, Pedro. Those were the thoughts I wanted to share about the common ground I see in the different projects that I think demonstrate that we have been able to do great work that's quite deep, committed, resilient to thinking about the conditions in which research is conducted in Latin America. Thank you very much. All right, great, Florencio. Thank you for your thoughts, for that valuable reflection. And it's always important to think about these projects that are in the ecosystem as a one thing, right? Thinking about what you're saying about this comprehensive view we need to have, that we need to include all of the actors with respect, commitment, and with this team mindset. Thank you so much. So with this, we are concluding the conference, our second day. We would like to thank you all for your contributions, for the presentations, the reflections, the conversations we've been having in these 2 days. We see that we have diverse realities in our region, but common challenges when it comes to designing, implementing innovative initiatives that can produce institutional transformations to continue closing the gap. We are sharing a link to a survey. It's very important for us to hear your thoughts to continue improving our work. We would like to thank all of you for joining us here today, for making this possible. We would also like to thank the presenters, all of our presenters for today, Idelia, Luis Felipe, Santiago, Andrés, Giovanni, César, Leslie, Florencia, our regional partners, SUMA team and KIX LAC team members for making this possible, and our interpreters that were here with us today. On our 10th anniversary as SUMA, we are continuing with our committing to transform educational systems in Latin America and the Caribbean with rigor, excellency, context, and collaboration to continue working to a more fair and equitable education in our region. Before we go, I would like to ask you, our panel members, to turn on your cameras so we can take a screenshot. We'll give you a few seconds to turn on your cameras. And while we do that, once again, thank you for your time, for your commitment to continue strengthening education in our region. I think we are ready for the group photo. Great. All right, then, once again, thank you, everybody, and see you soon. Take care. Thank you.
Gracias a todos.
Thanks, everybody.